For 18 years, Graham lived with the ghost of a perfect July afternoon. The last time he saw his wife, Corinne, and their 6-year-old daughter, Elara, alive. The official story was a likely abduction. Their abandoned picnic, a haunting tableau of a happy moment violently interrupted. But when a cold case detective shows him a high-resolution photo of Elara's drawing, the one found at the scene, Graham sees what everyone missed: a tall, shadowy third figure drawn standing behind a tree, a detail that turns his private grief into a chilling hunt for a man who was never supposed to exist. Every story leaves an echo, and we'd be honored if you'd let us know your thoughts on this one in the comments below. Your perspective helps these stories live on. The silence in Graham's house was a living thing. For 18 years, it had been his constant companion, a heavy blanket that smothered every memory and every hope. He still lived in the same 2-story colonial where he and Corinne had brought Elara home from the hospital. He'd never had the strength to leave, and in doing so had turned his own home into a museum of loss. Elara's room remained untouched, a time capsule from 1994. Her small bed was still neatly made, a stuffed rabbit propped against the pillow, its button eyes staring into the perpetual twilight of the drawn curtains. Graham hadn't opened those curtains since the day it happened. The sun felt like a betrayal. His life had become a series of quiet rituals designed to keep the grief at a manageable distance. He worked from home as an architect, his drawings precise and logical, a stark contrast to the chaos that ruled his inner world. He ate his meals alone at the large dining table, the 2 empty chairs across from him serving as silent accusers. The years had sanded down the sharp edges of his pain, leaving behind a dull, constant ache. He was no longer the frantic, desperate man who had helped search parties comb every inch of Blackwood State Park. He was just a man waiting for time to run out. The phone call came on a Tuesday, a day as gray and unremarkable as any other. The voice on the other end was professional, measured, and belonged to a Detective Albright. He was with the county's cold case unit. The words sent a familiar, sickening jolt through Graham's body, a phantom limb of dread he thought had long gone numb. Cold cases were rarely reopened without a reason. "Mr. Sanders," Albright said, his tone even, "we've been reviewing some older files with new technology. I was hoping I could stop by to show you something related to your wife and daughter's case." Graham agreed, his voice a dry rasp. An hour later, a man in his late 40s with tired eyes and a rumpled suit was sitting in his living room. Albright didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled a tablet from his briefcase, the sleek modern device looking alien against the backdrop of Graham's dated furniture. "As you know, the primary piece of evidence recovered from the scene was your daughter's drawing." Albright began tapping the screen. An image appeared, the familiar heartbreaking crayon sketch. A smiling mother and daughter holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Graham had seen it 100 times in the original evidence photos. It was the last thing Elara ever created. "We recently had our lab create a high-resolution scan and run it through some new enhancement software," Albright continued. "It's designed to pick up faint impressions and color differentiations the naked eye would miss. I want you to look closely at the right side of the drawing, behind the large tree." Albright zoomed in. The image became pixelated for a moment, then sharpened. Graham leaned forward, his heart beginning to hammer against his ribs. There, tucked behind the thick trunk of a crudely drawn oak tree, was something he had never seen before. It was faint, sketched in a dark brown crayon that had blended into the tree's outline over the years. It was the figure of a man, tall, stick-like, with no discernible features, but undeniably there, a shadow hiding in plain sight. "My God," Graham whispered, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch the screen. "Who's that?" "That's what we'd like to find out," Albright said grimly. "It was never mentioned in the original reports. It seems everyone for 18 years simply missed it. We're reclassifying the case. We're no longer looking for a random abductor. We're looking for someone who was there with them. Someone your daughter saw." When the detective left, the silence in the house was different. It was no longer heavy and empty. It was charged, electric with questions. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the ghost of that July afternoon had a face, even if it was just a featureless sketch. Graham felt a sensation so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. A flicker of purpose. He went to the hall closet and pulled out a dusty box labeled Case Files. Inside were the copies of every police report, every interview transcript, every newspaper clipping he had collected in those first, frantic years. The hunt was no longer over. It had just begun. Graham spent the next 3 days immersed in the past, the floor of his study disappearing under a sea of yellowing paper. He was looking for a ghost. He read through the witness statements from that day in 1990, his eyes scanning for any mention of a man seen with Corinne and Elara. There were a dozen or so interviews, a family having a barbecue a quarter-mile away, a pair of teenage hikers, a park ranger. None of them had seen anything unusual. Then he found the name. Arthur Vance. The original report described him as a freelance photographer, known to wander the park taking pictures of nature. The interviewing officer had noted that Vance seemed agitated and uncooperative, and had dismissed him as an eccentric with nothing useful to add. But something in the brief transcript snagged Graham's attention. Vance had mentioned he was working on a project documenting the park's old-growth trees. The picnic site was right in the middle of a grove of ancient oaks. He would have been nearby. Finding a reclusive photographer from 18 years ago was a challenge. He wasn't listed in any phone book, and an internet search turned up nothing but a few gallery listings from the late 80s. Graham's architectural work had given him experience with public records. He spent a day at the county records office and finally found a property deed. Arthur Vance owned a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods about 20 miles from the town. The drive out to the cabin was tense. Graham's old sedan rattled down a dirt road that seemed to shrink the further he went, the trees closing in around him. He found the cabin at the end of the path, a small, weathered structure with a plume of smoke curling from its stone chimney. He knocked on the door, his heart pounding a nervous rhythm. The man who answered was thin and wiry, with a wild mane of gray hair and a beard that reached his chest. His eyes were sharp and suspicious. "What do you want?" he grumbled, his hand resting on the doorframe as if to block entry. "Arthur Vance?" Graham asked. "My name is Graham Sanders. My wife and daughter went missing in Blackwood Park in 1994. The police spoke with you back then." Recognition, and then a deep wariness settled over Arthur's face. "I told them everything I knew, which was nothing. I'm not talking about that day again." He started to close the door. "Wait," Graham said, pulling out a printed copy of the enhanced drawing. "Please, just look at this." Arthur hesitated, then took the paper, his eyes squinting at the image. Graham watched as the photographer's gaze locked onto the hidden figure behind the tree. His defensive posture softened, replaced by a look of intense concentration. "I'll be damned," Arthur muttered, looking from the paper to Graham. "They never showed me this. They just asked if I saw a struggle." He opened the door wider. "You better come in." The inside of the cabin smelled of wood smoke and photographic chemicals. It was cluttered but organized, every surface covered with books, cameras, and stacks of black and white prints. Arthur cleared a space at a small table. "I remember that day," he said, his voice softer now. "I was a few hundred yards from that picnic spot. I saw your wife and daughter. They seemed happy. I didn't see anyone else with them, but I was focused on my work." He ran a hand through his messy hair. "It's always bothered me. I felt like I should have seen something." "Do you still have your photos from that day?" Graham asked, a thread of hope tightening in his chest. Arthur let out a dry chuckle. "Son, I have my photos from every day. I never throw anything away." He gestured to a corner of the cabin where dozens of cardboard boxes were stacked nearly to the ceiling. "My negatives are in there. All of them. If you've got the time, we can look." For the next 2 days, Graham and Arthur worked in the dim light of the cabin, a strange partnership forged by a shared, decades-old tragedy. They went through box after box, pulling out sleeves of negatives and holding them up to a light board. The process was slow and methodical. They saw countless images of trees, streams, and wildlife. Every so often, a human figure would appear in the distance, a hiker, a fisherman, but none matched the tall, shadowy man from Elara's drawing. Graham's hope began to fade, the familiar weight of disappointment settling back onto his shoulders. They were on the last box, one labeled July, Aug. 1994. Arthur pulled out a contact sheet, his fingers tracing the tiny frames. Mostly shots of the river that day, he said, his voice flat with fatigue. And here, the oak grove. Graham leaned over his shoulder. The sheet was filled with images of bark, leaves, and shafts of sunlight. And then, in the bottom right corner, there were 3 frames that were different. They were taken from a distance, looking through the trees toward a clearing. "That's them," Graham breathed. The first frame showed Corinne and Elara sitting on their red and white checkered blanket. The second was a closer shot of Elara holding up a sandwich. And the third frame made the air leave Graham's lungs. Corinne and Elara were still on the blanket, but they were no longer alone. A man was standing beside them, his back mostly to the camera, gesturing as he spoke to Corinne. He was tall, wearing a baseball cap, and even from a distance, there was something unsettlingly familiar about his posture. Arthur grabbed a magnifying loupe, his hand shaking slightly as he placed it over the tiny image. "I don't remember taking this," he whispered. "He must have just been there for a moment." Graham didn't need the loupe. He knew who it was. The world tilted on its axis, and 18 years of unresolved grief crashed down on him with the force of a tidal wave. The man in the photograph, the shadow in his daughter's drawing, was Quentin. An architect Graham had employed and then fired for stealing money and making inappropriate comments to female staff. He had fired him in April of 1994, just 3 months before the picnic. Graham stumbled back from the table, a strangled cry caught in his throat. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a stranger. It was a man he knew, a man he had brought into his life, who had then ripped it apart and hidden in the shadows of a child's drawing for 18 years. He snatched the contact sheet and ran out of the cabin, fumbling for his car keys. He had to get to Albright. He had to show him the face of the ghost that had haunted him for half his life. The hunt was over. Now, it was time for the reckoning. The drive back to town was a blur of adrenaline and white-hot rage. Graham clutched the contact sheet in his hand like a sacred text, the tiny image of Quentin a brand on his mind. He called Detective Albright, his voice cracking with an urgency that cut through 18 years of quiet despair. "I found him," Graham said, the words tumbling out. "The man from the drawing. I have a photograph of him with my family." He met Albright at the station. In a sterile interrogation room, he laid the contact sheet and Arthur's magnifying loupe on the metal table. Albright studied the image for a long time, his expression hardening. He looked up at Graham, his tired eyes now sharp with focus. "You know this man?" "His name is Quentin Black," Graham said, the name tasting like poison. "He worked for me. I fired him a few months before they disappeared." The machinery of law enforcement, so slow and quiet for nearly 2 decades, roared to life. Within an hour, Albright's team had a file on Quentin Black. After being fired, he had left the state. He had a record, a string of arrests in Oregon for stalking, harassment, and eventually a conviction for assault that had landed him in prison for 5 years. He'd been released in 2002 and had fallen off the grid. It took another day of digital detective work to find him. He was living under an assumed name, Markham, working as a handyman in a quiet suburb 2 hours away. Albright laid out the plan. A tactical team would execute a no-knock warrant at dawn. Graham insisted on being there. It wasn't a request. It was a demand born of a father's and a husband's right to see the end. Albright, seeing the iron resolve in Graham's eyes, reluctantly agreed on the condition that he stay in an unmarked car a block away. The morning was cool and damp as Graham sat in the passenger seat of the detective's car, watching the suburban streetlights blink off one by one. He saw the tactical team, shadows in the pre-dawn gloom, converge on a small, unassuming house. The sharp crack of the door being breached echoed in the quiet street. For a few tense minutes, there was nothing. Then, a figure was led out in handcuffs. It was Quentin. He was older, heavier, his hair thinning, but it was unmistakably him. The shadow from the drawing, the ghost from the photograph, was now just a man in a t-shirt, blinking in the sudden light. Back at the station, the confrontation Graham had waited for finally happened. though not as he had imagined. He sat behind a one-way mirror, watching as Albright and another detective questioned Quentin. At first, Quentin denied everything, his voice calm, arrogant. He claimed he hadn't been in the state in 20 years. Then Albright slid the photograph across the table. Graham watched as Quentin's composure shattered. The man stared at the image of himself with Corinne and Elara, his face crumbling. The confession that followed was a torrent of pathetic, self-pitying rage. He had been obsessed with Corinne, convinced she should have been his. Getting fired had been the final insult. He had spent months stalking them, learning their routines. On that July day, he followed them to the park. He approached them at the picnic, pleading, then demanding that Corinne leave Graham. When she laughed at him and told him she was going to call the police, he snapped, "I just wanted to scare her," he sobbed, his face buried in his hands. "I told them we were going for a walk, to a prettier spot I knew, a place by the old quarry." He led the detectives to a remote, overgrown area of the park, miles from the picnic site, a place the original search parties had never reached. And there, in two shallow graves beneath a canopy of silent trees, the search for Corinne and Elara Sanders finally came to an end. The epilogue of Graham's story was not written in headlines or courtrooms, but in the quiet dignity of a funeral held 18 years too late. He stood before two caskets, surrounded by friends and family who had shared his long vigil of uncertainty. Arthur Vance stood beside him, his camera for once absent, his hand resting briefly on Graham's shoulder. The pain was immense. A fresh wound laid open over an old scar. But for the first time, it was a clean pain. The torment of not knowing, the endless loop of what-ifs, was gone. Justice would follow its slow, grinding path. But for Graham, the resolution had already come. He sold the house, the museum of his grief, and moved to a small apartment by the coast. He didn't need the ghosts anymore. He could carry the memory of his wife and daughter in his heart. The real them, the smiling woman on the blanket, the little girl with a crayon and a vision of the sun, not the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He had found the truth in a child's drawing, and in doing so had finally found his way out of the woods. The story of Graham and Elara raises a difficult question about memory and evidence. When faced with a tragedy, do you think it's better to trust the imperfect memories of those involved, or to rely only on the hard, physical evidence, even if it might be incomplete? We appreciate you spending your time with us today. If this story made you think, please consider hitting the like button, as it truly helps us to continue bringing these narratives to light.